5 facts about the 2 most important commandments. Hi, welcome to today's little lesson. Thank you so much for joining me once again. We're going to focus our attention on this little lesson and perhaps the next one on the 2 commandments that Jesus said were the 2 greatest commandments. And the purpose in this little lesson and the next is to examine ourselves to see how well we're doing at keeping those 2 greatest commandments. And it can't hurt, right, to have a little self-examination here and ask ourselves the question, am I in line with God's will in keeping the 2 greatest commandments? All right, so we're going to kind of look at them and break them down a little bit. I'm hoping to present to you 5 irrefutable facts regarding those 2 great commandments. But first of all, let's talk about those 2 great commandments. You know, there was a time when a man came up to Jesus and asked him which was the greatest commandment of the law. And Jesus didn't hesitate. He didn't give any kind of a vague answer. It was cut and clear. He said, this is Matthew 22 and verse number 37, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment." And so that was true, of course, both in Old and New Covenants. It's true for us. The great commandment for you and the great commandment for me, the foremost one, the one that we ought to be focused on more than any other one, is loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And Jesus didn't stop there because there was more that needed to be said. And I hope that we'll see momentarily why Jesus didn't stop there. He said then, the second is like it. So that means there's a similar commandment that's like it. And it's second only to that first commandment. So we know what our first priority should be. Now we're going to learn what our second priority should be. And it's like the first and foremost commandment. Jesus said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? Now hold that thought. Jesus finished that little dialogue by saying, on these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. And so certainly nobody can debate that those 2 commandments, if you keep those 2 commandments, you're doing well. You're likely to be keeping all the other commandments that are found within the law and the prophets. And so if you want to simplify your spiritual life and your devotion to the Lord, it'd be good to think about these things. And this is, of course, why James says, a New Testament author, a New Testament apostle, whoever keeps the royal law in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, he does well. Okay, so James echoes the sentiments that we find from the lips of Jesus, that it's really important to love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, you're doing well. Now, let's jump back up to the foremost commandment, loving God, heart, mind, soul, and strength. I think sometimes when we read that commandment, we think to ourselves, wow, that's right, I need to be thinking and more loving thoughts about God, because to love him, of course, that's going to be in my heart and my mind. And so I just need to love him more with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my soul and my strength. And so let me just think more often loving thoughts and think about how much I love God. And there's no doubt that thinking about God and loving him within our hearts and minds and our meditation is part of an expression of loving him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. Don't get me wrong, but it's just a part of an expression for loving God. Why? Because it's very clear from Scripture that we express our love for God primarily by keeping his commandments. Loving God is more than just a thought or a feeling in one's heart. It's expressed by obedience to God's commandments. Because if you love someone, you want to please them, right? And this is God, so to please him, we're obviously going to obey him. And so many times in the Old Testament, scores and scores of times, the connection is made, love God and keep his commandments. And that is also found, of course, in the New Testament. Jesus said in John 14, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And similarly, he said, he who has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And John wrote in his first epistle, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. Okay, so if you want to obey, express obedience to loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, you express that by keeping his commandments. Now let's just go to the next logical step here. What's the second greatest commandment after loving him with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, which is expressed by keeping his commandments? It's the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. And so with those premises in mind, we can make the conclusion that the foremost way that we can express our love for God is by loving our neighbor as ourselves, because love for God is expressed by obedience to his commandments, and his foremost commandment after the great commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves. So the foremost way that you can express your love for God is by loving your neighbor. And this fits right into a common theme here at Little Lessons when Jesus foretold of the future judgment of the sheep and the goats, doesn't it? I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. The sheep express their love for Jesus by loving their neighbor as themselves. Okay? So it behooves us to ask ourselves the question, how well am I doing at loving my neighbor as I love myself? Because that's a good indication of how much I love God. Right? I think that is, irrefutable. And if we look at it from a little different angle, what's the foremost way that I could love my neighbor in light of all of that truth? Well, the foremost way I could love my neighbor is by helping my neighbor, encouraging my neighbor, admonishing my neighbor, doing whatever I can to help my neighbor love God with all of his or her heart, mind, soul, and strength. And if I'm going to help my neighbor to love God with all of his or her heart, mind, soul, and strength, that would include encouraging, helping my neighbor to love their neighbors as themselves. See how this all fits in there? And that's why Jesus said a second commandment is like it. These are so congruous, interrelated, intertwined. They just can't be separated. And there's one last question I want to ask where we're going to start our next little lesson. If I'm not really concerned about my neighbor and my neighbor's spiritual health and my neighbor's love for God and love for neighbor, if I'm not concerned about my neighbor's eternal destiny, like neighbors who are not on the road that leads to life, if I'm not concerned about that to the point of doing something, how could I possibly make a claim to loving my neighbor as myself? And if I can't make a claim honestly to loving my neighbor as myself, how can I be making a claim to loving God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength? Well, you see, I can't. Okay, so something to ponder until the next time we get together on Little